Okay. So, in the previous attempt at this stream, we briefly summarized the concept of whiteness, how it came to exist in the United States, which pretty much invented whiteness, and how it was used as a gavel against the black community specifically. Now we're going to talk about the model minority myth, and we're going to delve into how it negatively affects Asian groups, right? So the model minority myth is a perception that specific kinds of immigrants, specifically Asians mostly, but the model minority myth is also wielded in some instances against Jewish Americans, also in the form of conspiracy theory, because it calls, there's a bunch of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the relative success of Jewish American groups. But it's generally wielded against relatively privileged minority communities in the United States that seem to have had access to economic privileges that were considered reserved for white America otherwise. The Asian community is the number one group about which this myth is perpetuated. Now, the economic privilege of the Asian community relative to other immigrant communities is real, but it's also very overblown in the sense that there are many, many, many economically underprivileged Asian communities that exist even within said, the Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Indian communities, which generally are probably the four Asian groups that are considered to be the most economic privileged. Within each of those groups, you will find very working class pockets of people that are very underrepresented in American culture, naturally probably because socioeconomic marginalization makes you less likely to be able to make yourself visible in a culture outside of your workplace. And economic exploitation and economic marginalization inherently makes you less visible because you're spending all of your time trying to make ends meet. You have less free time inherently because of it. And I'm sure that there are other implications about emotional labor that also factor in, where the kinds of jobs that working class people work, even like blue collar workers who are making ends meet. If you're an Asian working a blue collar job, you just don't have the energy, say, to be going out and making yourself represented in the larger community every Friday night, right? So these are all things that are naturally as a result of economic inequality. Now, let's take the... So yeah, in summary of that point, the model minority myth paints Asians as this uniquely successful immigrant group. It is based in some reality, which is in itself is based in overwhelming privilege on the parts of those successful communities. But it's also overblown because there are plenty of economically marginalized Asian groups, even within the so-called privileged Asian groups, subgroups. Generally, this myth is used to perpetuate a view of immigration itself, that immigrants themselves should be expected to be extremely economically successful because of the model minority of, doctors who come from places like China, Japan, India, and South Korea, who came here with relatively modest economic means, especially in the case of, say, India or China, where people came here with relatively modest economic means and turned it into a significant amount of wealth. And the idea is that the Chinese community did it, the Indian community did it, there's no reason why you can't do it too. Now, obviously, this is ahistorical because it doesn't factor in the relative privilege of those successful communities. It overrepresents the relative success of those communities. And additionally, it doesn't account for the fact that the communities that it's being wielded against are also, one of those communities was literally brought here against their will and kept in systemic economic repression, even from the point where they were released from slavery. Now that that's out of the way, and I've properly emphasized a very important and mandatory solidarity that the Asian community must always, the larger Asian community must always show to other people of color in America. We can talk about how the model minority myth negatively affects Asian people as well. Because at the end of the day, my value on the surface to white America as an Asian person is to provide them with a case study and an example of how immigrants should be expected to be puppy sparking as a case study for how immigrants should be expected to be uniquely successful, disproportionate even to white Americans in the country, in order for us to be accepted as part of American culture. So it sets a standard in which Asian Americans are not actually allowed to be regular Americans. We're not allowed to just have the same level of success that our parents had, right? We're not allowed to just be like, we're expected to be stellar, and we're expected to be stellar in very particular fields that measure up to these extremely narrow metrics of success. That we're expected to be the doctors, the engineers, the very successful lawyers, the business people, but not the CEOs. But we're expected to be the analysts and the bankers and the accountants, right? We're expected to be the guys counting your money, not the ones actually paying you to count their money. So every time that look, I was born in the United States, all right? I'm a friggin' American, all right? And part of being an American is that I get to do whatever the hell I want with my life. Or at least ostensibly, part of being American is I get to do whatever the hell I want with my life. Which means if I want to be a music composer, I should be able to do that. And as long as I'm talented and hardworking, I can make a career out of that. And additionally, I should not be perceived as any less in society because I made the choice to be a music composer as opposed to being a business person or an engineer or a doctor, right? That is that's probably the least controversial conception of a human dignity that I could think of with regards to the Asian community, right? That like, not the Asian community specifically, with regards to being just like an American trying to succeed in a field, is that I shouldn't be stigmatized for performing a certain profession within my desire, as long as I'm good at that profession and it's not like an inherently immoral thing to do. There's no reason why I shouldn't be celebrated for being a composer. Unfortunately, what happens is that because my value to white America is so rooted in my ability to give people ammunition against other communities that are less privileged than I am, or the people in which are less privileged than I am generally. When I fall outside of the roles that give them said ammunition, for example, being, say, an artist or media person in a race that's not supposed to represent itself in media or art, but rather is supposed to do the money stuff or the medicine stuff, right? So because the parameters of my value to a white-dominated society have been very narrowly defined around my ability to represent my community in a way that benefits white America. So specifically, white America's ability to discriminate against black and brown people, black and brown specifically referring to the black community. And because that is the defining parameter of my value in American white society, when I go outside of those parameters, so specifically speaking, let's say that I am representative of downward economic mobility in my community, which, generally speaking, if you are a South Asian American in arts or media, chances are it's because you had the privilege to pursue such a career, and you're going into a career where you are underrepresented and you have a lower chance of finding economic success, you're probably going to find some level of, on average, you're probably going to find some level of downward economic mobility because you're going into an inherently less lucrative profession. So when I do that, I am directly countering the notion that Indians are intrinsically better at succeeding in industry than other immigrant groups, right? And I am directly countering the notion that Indians are smarter about succeeding in industry than our counterparts because, hey, I'm an Indian trying to be an artist, right? Like, what could be a more diluted and misguided life decision than that? So what happens is that you are expected as an Asian person not only to be a model minority, but to completely submit to the roles that are assigned to you within Asian society. Including an inherent submissiveness about the way that we are expected to present ourselves and be perceived. Now, I have definitely faced marginalization for being outspoken, for being opinionated. Nothing compared to what women of color experience, and probably not, depending on the space that I inhabited, it was less than your average white woman as well. Though in certain spaces, probably more so. Though mostly probably I'm more allowed to be opinionated as an Indian man, or someone loosely identified as an Indian man, than your average white woman would be in most spaces. And I acknowledge and I don't dispute that privilege or the existence of that privilege. But I definitely am not afforded the same level of, I'm definitely disproportionately discriminated against relative to white men for going outside of, say, specific gender norms that are wielded against me. I have less freedom to shirk the gender norms that are set for me, and I have less freedom to shirk the racial gender norms that are set for me. And so going outside of those norms, you sacrifice A, a lot of your privilege, and B, you are performing a certain level of resistance against an expectation of you that you're not technically allowed to do in white society. Now, whatever expectations exist of me to be submissive or soft-spoken or not get angry, they're wielded probably 5 to 10 to 20 to 100 times more against other kinds of Asian men. And probably, I would say, probably a similar contrast to maybe a lesser order of magnitude exists between South Asian women and, say, East and Southeast Asian women. That if you're, there is a definite more systematic fetishization and submissiveness trope about East Asian and Southeast Asian women than there is against South Asian women in particular. Because, you can say a lot of things about South Asian women. They're not stereotypically soft-spoken. Many of them are, but having grown up with an Indian mom, I can't say that that's my stereotype. The larger point being that, man, it's so difficult to talk about this because it's such a holistic concept. And part of it is just, dude, trust me. But there is a real extent to which Asian Americans' very existence in this country is considered to be subservient in some sense to the white gaze, right? And that exists tenfold to the way that women are perceived. Sorry, not tenfold. yeah, like for Asian women, that is meant in a particularly sexualized manner, and specifically in a manner that should denote total sexual submission, because it fulfills a very white male fantasy of dominance over women of color. And then for men, it's a different kind of dominance. It's a non-sexual dominance, right? We're actually expected to be inherently asexual beings, and we're infantilized in such a way, right? That's kind of the difference between infantilizing men and infantilizing women, right? When women are infantilized, it is inherently sexual. There's something almost pedophilic about it. When men are infantilized, it's the opposite effect. We're actually desexualized. Because men are expected to be dominant figures. So infantilization operates in different ways depending on which group is being, treated as childlike or submissive. And that submissiveness trope is wielded against all genders in the Asian community, but it has different outcomes depending on which community you're a part of. This is also part of why you will see a big crossover between, say, Asian men and forms of inceldom, because Asian men definitely experience a level of dating racism, right? This is supported in most dating app statistics. Of course, in the case of women, this doesn't manifest in dating racism. It manifests in literal physical violence, right? So if you want to make a judgment as to which group has it worse, it's not a contest. Which, again, is not to say that men should have gender tropes wielded against them. It's just that, hate crimes against elderly Asian men, which are a thing and are a big problem, are indicative of something a little bit different than, say, when you go to a, massage parlor of women that you have spent your life fetishizing, and you shoot them up because I don't know what the story is behind that. I'm not going to speculate there regarding the story itself, but there's definitely a dynamic of entitlement to sexual domination that, people tend to have, especially white men, that they will often weaponize against Asian women, because they perceive Asian women as an easy ticket to that kind of sense of domination, of dominance, that they feel like, white women refuse to entitle them to, right? So this is the problem with sexual fetishization, which is that, that sexual fetishization carries with it a certain sensation of entitlement to the body and sexuality of the person that you're fetishizing. And this is the issue that women consistently deal with, and that queer Asian men also deal with a lot, right? Queer Asian men also deal with pretty abject desexualization by the queer community. And then in cases where they don't, they're treated like objects and expected, there's also a huge amount of angst wielded at them, where queer men are expected, I would say probably that queer Asian men are expected to be bottoms, specifically because of the same submissiveness tropes, that because you present more femme than the average Asian man, than straight Asian men, you're expected to carry a lot of the same submissiveness tropes that are associated with Asian women, right? So these are all really messed up ways in which perception of the Asian community seriously negatively affects really negatively affects mostly communities that aren't mine, though I can say something about desexualization and dating racism, but I can't really say I know what it feels like to be fetishized. At least not systemically, right? I've been fetishized by certain human beings. There were times it made me feel uncomfortable, but I never felt like on the basis of being fetishized, I was being deprived of any kind of sexual agency, right? That's not a luxury that your average Asian woman or queer Asian man has. Sorry, I identify as a queer Asian man, but like, I certainly don't present this one, right? So when I talk about queer Asian men, I'm talking mostly Asian men who date men, specifically East Asian men who date men, right? And Southeast Asian men who date men, who are definitely expected to be submissive, who are definitely expected to be bottoms, right? And they fulfill a certain white male fantasy for domination. And part of the expectation of a model minority is that whatever role it is that white America wants us to play, we play that role without complaint and without protest. Eerie noise. Okay. As for the case of Atlanta, I can't possibly begin to speculate as to why what happened. Specifically, what happened was a white guy went into a massage spa and killed 8 Asian women. It's very hard for me to conceive of a narrative in which anti-Asian racism does not play a role. It's very easy for me to conceive of a narrative in which the systemic fetishization of Asian women's bodies and queer Asian men's bodies plays a role. Though to say it did would be educated speculation or educated conjecture, whichever you prefer. But there's a lot of extremely messed up dynamics that ultimately root back to a perception of Asianness and the Asian identity and kind of the white perception of Asian culture, which, is a vacuous term at best because, quite frankly, like, there are anywhere from 70 to 150 different Asian cultures out of even the first batch of Asian immigrants to come to this country. So there's a perception of that. What constitutes Asianness culturally that affects the way that Asians are treated and disproportionately threatens physically Asian women and queer Asian men with physical violence. And that generally people who present as Asian people who present as Asians who date men are expected to fill certain roles at the behest of those men, right? And look, like, straight Asian guys are perceived with the same kind of, not the same, perceived with similar levels of expectations, but those expectations are inherently different, loaded in different ways, right? As a South Asian guy, the things that I face under white feminism, and I will self-identify as a man because, to look at me, you don't know my pronouns. I largely conform to assigned male at birth traits. The expectations that are wielded at me as a non-black man of color, who expresses and presents in a pretty like in what would be presumed as, you know, the mannerisms of a straight man, right? And I'm not involved in queer dating spaces either, so I don't present myself in spaces in which I might be, you know, threatened by the kinds of violence that queer Asian men with active dating / sex lives would. As a result, I'm not under physical threat by the elements of white supremacy that people who make themselves, or not make themselves, people who in white society are sexually available, in terms of like are considered by white America to be sexually available to white men, right? So the groups that I described, right? All Asian women, because obviously like patriarchy has this notion of women that like men are inherently entitled to all women's bodies. And additionally, that queer men are entitled to submissive queer men's bodies, right? And so that fetishism creates an entitlement over, or not creates, it is rooted in an entitlement over, an entitlement to the submission of Asian bodies, right? And that's part of our culture and part of our personalities. It's a very holistic discussion. Very difficult to talk with dominating coherence on the subject, but I hope that was somewhat elucidating. We'll try and stick a TLDR on it, right? So, model minority myth is rooted in anti-blackness, but it describes a perception of what Asians are expected to be, largely to function a white narrative that immigrants should be expected to have success disproportionate and have a value to American society disproportionate to even white members of that society, right? Which means that the expectations wielded against us are in themselves racist and unfair, because as Americans, we just want to be Americans, but we're expected to be better than your average American. And then alongside that, we're expected to submit to those roles that are assigned to us. And in the case of Asian women, a lot of that involves infantilization and a very sexually charged infantilization, in which, you know, white men are kind of filling out weird desires of achieving sexual gratification with, you know, I guess, particularly submissive people, women and queer men who share mannerisms with children, at least in terms of how submissive they are. That gets a little bit more into the weeds about the correlations between American male obsession, not just American, just patriarchal obsession with submissive sexual partners, and, you know, the prevalence of pedophilia in those cultures. But that expectation of Asians to be submissive is primarily wielded against Asian women in the way that they're fetishized. And that fetishization that is rooted in the perception of Asian submissiveness is then wielded against the same women when they're expected, again, to physically submit. And that leads to violence against the same Asian women, right? And we should be cognizant of that when we're talking about violence against Asian women, as happened last night, where, you know, there's a very clear through line between this, you know, the criminal who literally shot 8 women, his own kind of brazen fetishes, and the violence that he perpetrated that correlates definitely with an entitlement to the bodies that he took, and the lives that he took, without getting into conjecture about what his motives were. It definitely falls in with a certain entitlement that white America has to Asian bodies, particularly East and Southeast Asian bodies, though South Asian bodies are certainly not safe from that same kind of violence. All that's to say, white American violence against the Asian community has always been a real thing. The physical violence has taken a serious turn for the worse in the past year as a result of coronavirus. But that violence has always been more than just physical, though it certainly has been physical, and the physicality of that violence has gone ignored largely. And it's important that we stop ignoring it. And we also stop ignoring the passive cultural and emotional abuse of the Asian community by a white-dominated American culture, right? And that as Asians, and particularly as privileged Asians, as like South Asians, for example, we definitely need to stop letting a white-dominated political culture pit groups of color against each other in the same sense, and that solidarity is extremely important with the black community. Solidarity is extremely important with Asian communities that are disproportionately affected by violence compared to, say, Indian communities who have not experienced definitely have not experienced the same precipitous rise in hate crime in the past year that, say, the Chinese community has. And other Asian communities that are very racistly treated as if, they are synonymous with Chinese people. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more content, the best thing you can do to support the channel is to click like and subscribe for notifications on future videos. I stream to Twitch more regularly than I upload to YouTube, so come through to twitch.tv/fantastic93 to participate in the chat. Otherwise, stay tuned for future videos. Have a great day.